The champagne flutes had just stopped chiming. The ballroom, perched 30 floors above the glittering, chaotic grid of San Francisco's financial district, was saturated with the kind of heavy, expectant silence only old money can afford. It was midnight on New Year's, and the air in the Nob Hill mansion felt thick, smelling of aged French perfume, Italian silk, and the faint, unmistakable bitterness of my father's expensive single malt scotch. The entire room, a tapestry of venture capitalists, fading real estate moguls, and socialite dependents, was focused on the colossal baccarat chandelier, where Robert Sullivan, my father, stood. His face was flushed with the kind of self-satisfied pride that had been cultivated over decades of unchallenged control in his specific, narrow world. He raised his glass one last time, his gaze sweeping past the rest of the glittering guests, past the awkward smiles of the people who owed him money, and settled with a proprietorial air upon my older brother, Ethan. Dad rarely addressed me directly in public, but the end of his toast was a laser-guided missile intended solely for me, Anya. "To Ethan," Dad boomed, his voice resonating across the polished marble floor and bouncing off the rare oil paintings. "The son who stayed, who built, who understands that true legacy is carved in granite, not coated in a cloud. He grasps the gravitas required to succeed in this town, the tangible connections, the generational wealth, the weight of a powerful name. As for the rest of you dreamers," he paused, dragging out the moment, making the silence unbearable, before his gaze finally pinned me where I stood by the massive, arched window overlooking the bay. "Remember this, some birds are born to soar globally, and some are simply never meant to rise above the altitude of their own youthful arrogance and theoretical success." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. I was the dreamer, the one who had abandoned his world of brick-and-mortar real estate for the unreliable and unproven field of global logistics for commercial space launch payloads. To Dad, I was a glorified travel agent for rockets. Ethan, the golden boy, gave me a pitying, well-rehearsed smile, the one he always used when I dared to challenge Dad's myopic worldview. They expected me to retreat, to storm out, or just disappear into the San Francisco night as the old me always had. But the old me had died 2 days before Christmas. The new me was calm, centered, and utterly lethal. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I never touched alcohol around them. It dulled the senses. I waited until the silence was so profound you could hear the distant foghorn on the bay. Then I reached into the sleek black portfolio clutch that held my phone, opened the screen, and placed it gently, precisely, on the edge of the mahogany table facing him. The screen glowed, displaying a simple, elegant confirmation. A first-class, one-way ticket from SFO to Tokyo, scheduled for 6 a.m. on January the 2nd. Under the confirmation code was the name, Anya M. Desai. The destination was not just Tokyo, but a small connecting flight to Kagoshima, Japan. "Happy New Year, Dad," I said, my voice steady and low, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Funny you should mention altitude. My new job title involves managing commercial payloads into geostationary orbit. That's an altitude of 22,000 miles, Dad. It's an altitude you truly cannot see from Nob Hill. But speaking of things that matter in your world, I'll need you to clarify one thing before I leave. You secretly sold the trust's controlling share in the 1888 Federal Building 2 weeks ago, didn't you? The pile of papers on your desk, the one labeled maintenance contract, that's actually the notarized purchase agreement for a majority stake to a firm called the Kagoshima Consortium, isn't it?" The room didn't just go silent, it seemed to physically compress. People froze mid-gasp, hands clutching champagne flutes like lifelines. The jazz band leader, halfway through raising his trumpet, lowered it slowly. Dad's face, which a moment ago had been the picture of unshakable authority, crumpled instantly into a mask of pure, absolute, sweating terror. Ethan's practiced smile shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked betrayal. They stared at the phone screen, at the irrefutable evidence of my planned departure and my devastating, impossible knowledge, then back at me, calculating exactly how far the dreamer had already risen above them. If you have ever had a moment where your family thought they knew exactly who you were, only for you to pull the rug out with a single irrefutable piece of evidence, please stop for a second, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. It might feel lonely to be the one holding the truth, the quiet one who sees the entire map. But trust me, There are millions of us who have walked this path. The path where a quiet document speaks louder than a lifetime of insults. Stick around, because the story of what Dad secretly did with the 1888 federal building and why I needed that flight confirmation to expose his desperation and save his legacy is about to get deeper and more destructive than any family secret you've ever heard. The true cost of his arrogance was about to be paid, and the receipt was in my hand. The Sullivan family's history wasn't something written in a genealogy book. It was etched in the granite of the 1888 federal building downtown. It was Dad's monument, a hulking, gorgeous, over-leveraged symbol of San Francisco's fading old guard that he proudly threw in my face every time I achieved a new career milestone outside his orbit. He didn't just own it, he was it. He used it to lecture me about gravitas and tangible assets, contrasting it with my work, which he called theoretical success in a vacuum. I grew up hearing about the building's original vaults, its copper eaves, and its exclusive tenant list more than I heard praise for my own academic or professional achievements. The building defined his reality, and he used it to define my shadow. I was the daughter who was always too much, too analytical, too interested in complex systems and engineering over aesthetics, too willing to leave the safe, predictable world of trust-funded wealth for the high-risk, high-reward territory of global technology. While Ethan, the golden boy, was being groomed in Dad's real estate firm, closing simple condo deals, failing upward, and racking up secret, massive debt on corporate cards Dad constantly had to bail him out of, I was earning my stripes in the hyper-competitive world of aerospace logistics. I learned how to move components worth hundreds of millions across borders, navigating complex international regulatory laws and high-level clandestine political negotiations. I didn't deal in square footage and rent rolls. I dealt in orbital mechanics, export controls, and sovereign asset protection. Dad, still clinging to his 1980s power tie and the belief that the city ended at the Bay Bridge, saw it all as playing with expensive toys. "No one needs a launch coordinator, Anya," he'd scoff. "They need a landlord. You need to be grounded." The actual betrayal, the silent, slow-motion financial disaster, began 6 months ago while I was in Toulouse, France, managing a critical component transfer for a European partner. A small, seemingly innocuous email from Dad popped up. It was a request for a limited power of attorney, just for signing routine property tax documents and utility management, while he was supposedly on a 3-week wellness retreat. I signed it instantly, digitally, without a second thought, the way I always signed documents for them, trusting that a father wouldn't deliberately sink his own children. It was the same blind, fatal error of trust that doomed Elodie Ramsey when her family used her POA to steal her life-saving surgery money. That limited POA was the first piece of the puzzle. The second, more devastating piece dropped a week before Christmas. Ethan was in full-blown financial hemorrhage, not the usual bounce check crisis, but a complete wipeout. He had taken a massive, undisclosed $30 million loan against the federal building to fund his catastrophic crypto real estate startup, a project Dad didn't even know existed. The loan documents were toxic. A short-term, high-interest note held by a private offshore holding entity called the Kagoshima Consortium. Ethan, predictably, hadn't managed the first payment. The default clause was brutal: a clean transfer of the building's controlling shares to the consortium if the payment wasn't met by January 3rd. This $30 million loan was a family secret. The real secret was that Dad, desperate to save Ethan's name and the legacy of the building, had used my limited POA, the one I signed for tax documents, to quietly sell the remaining controlling shares to the very same consortium. It was an act of sheer, panicked desperation designed to cover Ethan's default and buy them 90 more days of silence. He thought he was saving the family name, but he was merely postponing the inevitable, while simultaneously giving up all control to a ruthless, foreign, high-frequency finance player. He sold the building's soul to cover the golden boy's mistakes. I only discovered it because of a fluke of my own professional life. While running a cross-check on a global customs manifest for a launch payload heading through the Pacific Rim, my logistics system flagged a familiar entity: the Kagoshima Consortium. The name triggered a deep compliance alert. When I dug deeper, I found the SEC filing: my father's unauthorized sale of the remaining shares, leveraging my digital signature and the limited POA. The closing date? January 3rd. My father's condescending New Year's toast wasn't just about putting me down. It was a desperate, preemptive strike, an attempt to make me feel small, incompetent, and unworthy before the family implosion that he knew was coming the moment I discovered the truth. He needed me to believe I'd never be able to understand or stop what he'd done. But I already had the full financial audit, the complete flow of money, and the notarized purchase agreement. He didn't know that my work in complex global logistics meant I had a far more sophisticated understanding of offshore holding companies, shell structures, and international wire transfers than any local San Francisco lawyer. The building, the symbol of everything he held sacred, was gone, purchased with my own, unknowingly signed, legal consent. The new owners were not benign investors. They were aggressive financial raiders preparing a hostile takeover of a strategically important U.S. asset. My flight confirmation wasn't for a vacation. It was the only way to stop the disaster he had created, a surgical strike at the global altitude he had mocked. The key to my plan wasn't brute force. It was intellectual superiority and surgical timing, honed by years of managing billion-dollar deals in high-stakes environments. Vengeance, for me, was never about making them suffer a long, drawn-out punishment. It was about the immediate, irrefutable demonstration of how much their toxic world relied on the daughter they had spent a lifetime dismissing. It was about proving, with definitive action, that the dreamer was the only realist in the room. My expertise wasn't just in moving rockets, it was in the dense forest of regulatory compliance, international trade agreements, and deep-level asset tracing, skills completely foreign to Dad's localized real estate mindset. The Kagoshima Consortium, the buyer of the building, had one fatal flaw. They were primarily a shell company owned by a massive Japanese financial institution, and their acquisition of a heritage U.S. commercial property violated a specific, obscure clause in the U.S. federal banking regulations concerning foreign ownership of strategically important U.S. infrastructure. The 1888 Federal Building, situated next to the Reserve Bank and housing several sensitive government contractor offices, fell squarely into this category. My father, with his old-school local market vision, never would have seen the trap. Ethan, blinded by his own startup hubris, certainly missed it. I spent the 48 hours leading up to the New Year's party assembling my strike force from a hotel suite in the city. I contacted a colleague in Tokyo, a former regulatory attaché, who now worked in private compliance, and asked her to prepare an emergency filing with the Japanese Financial Services Agency, FSA. I simultaneously reached out to my mentor, a specialist in U.S. cross-border compliance, and provided him with the full audit of Ethan's original loan and Dad's subsequent unauthorized sale using my POA. I wasn't going to sue them in civil court. I was going to use a nuclear regulatory bomb to void the sale entirely, collapsing the entire chain of fraud and debt. The goal was not just to save the building, it was to save my father from the potentially criminal liability of violating my POA and federal law, and simultaneously to expose the rot, Ethan's irresponsibility, and Dad's blind devotion to his preferred son, to the entire family network. The public humiliation at the toast was the fuse. The regulatory filing was the explosion that would make the humiliation permanent. The flight confirmation, the one I placed on the table, was the final delivery mechanism. I wasn't flying to Tokyo to negotiate or take a vacation. I was flying to Tokyo to physically hand-deliver the finalized regulatory package to the FSA's main office before the consortium's lawyers could record the deed transfer on January 3rd. The Kagoshima Consortium was expecting a final wire transfer from Dad to cover the debt and finalize the sale. Instead, they were going to get a cease and desist order from their own government, triggered by a 30-year-old woman they'd collectively dismissed as a youthful, arrogant dreamer. When I left the party, the chaos was already erupting. Dad was cornered in a side room screaming hoarsely at Ethan, a pathetic sight I hadn't seen since I was a child. Aunt Eleanor, the family gossip queen, was already frantically dialing her lawyer, trying to calculate her own exposure. I walked past them all, the sound of the baccarat chandelier's soft humming the only noise I noticed. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I had planted the seed of their downfall and their salvation in one single devastating statement. The full transfer audit, along with the FSA notice and a single page detailing my new trust ownership structure, was scheduled to hit my father's private email at exactly 5 a.m. on January 2nd, 1 hour before my flight took off. When he woke up, he wouldn't see the New Year's sunrise. He would see a ticking clock, a catastrophic audit, and the face of the daughter he had just publicly humiliated. now holding the keys to his entire world. I reached my car, and the wheels were already turning toward SFO, taking me to the altitude I was always meant to occupy. The flight was quiet, a 12-hour cocoon of peace I hadn't felt in a decade. The sheer luxury of the first-class cabin felt like a well-earned reward after a lifetime of self-denial and endless family drama. I watched the golden sunrise paint the Pacific horizon, knowing that back in San Francisco, my father was currently reading the audit package, the one that detailed how Ethan's recklessness and his own panic had put the 1888 federal building in catastrophic breach of multiple international and federal laws. He would see his entire legacy, the cornerstone of his identity, hanging by a thread, and that thread was me. That was the essence of my vengeance, the shock, the exposure, the absolute, undeniable dismantling of his self-importance and the total shift of power. I landed in Tokyo, navigated the precise logistics of the regulatory filing, and checked into a discreet hotel near the FSA. My team's work was flawless. The news came via encrypted text from my mentor. FSA filing confirmed. Cease and desist order delivered to Kagoshima Consortium. The sale is voided. You saved the building, Anya. Robert Sullivan's company is financially solvent, but his control is finished. The real consequence wasn't financial ruin. It was the psychological fallout. My father had lost his story. He was no longer the brilliant patriarch. He was the man who almost lost everything and had to be rescued by the daughter he had condescendingly labeled arrogant. Ethan was stripped of his managing role, reduced to a low-level analyst in an ancillary department, a humiliation that cut him deeper than bankruptcy ever could. 2 days later, on January 4th, I was sitting in a high-rise office in Kagoshima, Japan, overlooking the volcanic bay and the busy port, when the commotion started outside the conference room. The door swung open, and there they were. My father, Robert Sullivan, looking exhausted and small, his suit visibly rumpled from the long-haul flight, and Ethan, pale and defeated, carrying a stack of my audit files like a heavy coffin. "Anya," Dad began, his voice barely a whisper, devoid of its usual booming, aggressive authority. We got your text. We're here." The text I had sent them simply read, "My flight confirmation wasn't for me. It was for the final signing ceremony. I saved your building. Now you fly here. My team will meet you at the Kagoshima Financial Center at 10 a.m. January 4th. Sign the papers I send you, or the FSA takes the building, and the full truth of the fraud will be public. Your only choice is to accept my solution." He hadn't flown to Japan to scold me. He had flown to Japan to surrender. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and looked at them. They were beaten, exposed, and entirely dependent on the person they had tried to crush with contempt. "Sit down, Dad," I said, pointing to the 2 empty chairs. "Ethan, we're here to sign the new operating agreement for the 1888 federal building. The building is now legally owned by the Anya Desai Interstellar Trust. I am the sole trustee, which means I control every single decision, every budget, every hire, and every future development. Your job, Dad, is to be the on-site property manager. Your salary will be 50% of what you used to pay yourself, with absolutely zero signing authority. Ethan, you will work directly for the building's maintenance crew. This is a job, not a title. The only thing you manage is trash collection, minor repairs, and coordinating supply deliveries. You are accountable to the building's head of operations." Dad's face flushed again, not with scotch, but with shock. "You're taking my building? Turning me into a superintendent? After I gave you everything?" "I'm giving you a job that requires you to be grounded," I corrected him, throwing his own condescending word back at him with icy precision. "And I'm giving the building a chance at financial solvency and federal compliance free from your legacy gambling. You have no choice." He looked at the papers, at the stoic Japanese lawyers waiting silently, and finally, at me. The man who publicly said I'd never rise above was now forced to take orders from the altitude I had reached. He didn't scream, he just sighed, a long, defeated sound that seemed to carry all the weight of his failed life. He picked up the pen and signed the documents that made him a mid-level employee in his own former empire. Ethan followed, his hand trembling. My forgiveness wasn't a speech or a hug. It was the silent, beautiful act of giving them a chance to rebuild a life free of the destructive, status-obsessed pretense they had lived. I could have let the FSA or the consortium demolish them entirely, leaving them with nothing. Instead, I stripped them of their pride and forced them into an existence based on actual, honest work and accountability. They lost their power, but they gained a future that was anchored in reality. It wasn't a fairy tale ending for them, but it was a real one. A true, hard-won pivot. I signed the final paper, and for the first time, I was the owner of the monument that once defined my shadow. I stayed in Kagoshima, not just for the meeting, but because I had just finalized a global distribution contract with a major satellite company based there. My life was no longer in San Francisco. My father and brother had to fly home and start their new, humble lives without me. The last thing I did before leaving the office was look at my father, who was still slumped in his chair, staring out at the bay. The Anya Desai Interstellar Trust will immediately sponsor a full scholarship for young women in aerospace engineering from the San Francisco Bay Area, starting this year, I informed him. You'll be responsible for managing the foundation's physical office space in the building. That is also part of your job. It was a final, silent, beautiful act of grace, using his false legacy to fund the futures of the daughters he never valued. He simply nodded, unable to meet my eyes. My life had changed profoundly. Their lives had changed, forced by circumstance. And it all started with one single devastating flight confirmation. The truth is, I never regretted the flight, or the trust, or the complete dismantling of the lie they called family. I am now based in Tokyo, navigating the stars, while the men who tried to clip my wings are forced to manage the ground beneath them. It's a different kind of ending, one without cheering or tearful hugs, but one where justice and a forced chance at change finally won. If you believe Anya made the right call by forcing her family to rebuild their lives from the ground up, instead of letting them fall apart entirely, please tell me what you would have done in the comments below. And don't forget to activate notifications so you don't miss the next story, where silence proves to be the loudest weapon.